Number 1, the Nataruk Massacre. 30 kilometers west of Lake Turkana in northern Kenya, there is a stretch of barren desert that 10,000 years ago was something else entirely. During the late Pleistocene and early Holocene transition, roughly 9,500 to 10,500 years ago, this was a lush lagoon shoreline. Permanent water, fish, vegetation, the kind of place worth living near, and the kind of place worth killing for. In 2012, Dr. Marta Mirazon-Lar and her team from Cambridge University's Leverhulme Center for Human Evolutionary Studies were conducting fieldwork as part of the ERC-funded In Africa project when they found 27 bodies. 21 adults and 6 children, most of the children under the age of 6. No older teenagers were found among the dead, which raises a specific and ugly possibility. They may have escaped, or they may have been taken. Of the 12 skeletons complete enough to analyze, 10 showed unambiguous evidence of violent death. That is an 83% violence rate among recoverable remains. The injuries cataloged across the site read like a forensic case file. Extreme blunt force trauma to skulls and cheekbones, broken hands, knees, and ribs, arrow lesions on the neck, stone projectile tips embedded in skull and chest. One adult male still had an obsidian bladelet lodged inside his cranium. Another received 2 crushing blows to the head from different angles, collapsing the skull in multiple directions. At least 4 individuals were found in positions indicating their hands had been bound at the time of death. This is not combat. This is execution. One of the victims was a woman in late-stage pregnancy. Fetal remains were recovered alongside her skeleton. Her hands and feet appear to have been bound. 3 stone artifacts were found embedded within 2 of the bodies. 2 of those artifacts were obsidian, a material rare in the local geology. The attackers brought their weapons from somewhere else. They traveled to this lagoon with the tools already made. Several of the dead were found face down, consistent with falling or being pushed into shallow water. None of them were buried. They were left where they fell, preserved only because the lagoon sediment slowly covered them over millennia. The dating is exceptionally robust. 3 independent methods were used: radiocarbon, optically stimulated luminescence, and uranium series dating. All 3 converge on the same window. 9,500 to 10,500 years ago, this makes Nataruk the earliest scientifically dated evidence of organized intergroup violence among nomadic hunter-gatherers. The only comparable site is Jebel Sahaba, also known as Cemetery 117 in Sudan, excavated in the 1960s. That site may be up to 13,000 years old, but it was dated with less reliable methods and represents a cemetery with accumulated violence over time, not a single massacre event. Mirazon-Lar interpreted the find as a raid for resources: water, dried fish, gathered food, possibly women and children taken as captives. The obsidian weapons and the systematic nature of the killing suggest a planned attack by an organized group. Harvard anthropologist Luke Glowacki noted that the find supports the idea that violence has deep evolutionary roots, independent of cultural advancement or the invention of agriculture. There is a rebuttal. Christopher Stoyanovsky published a response in Nature questioning whether the trauma was truly inflicted at the time of death or could have resulted from post-depositional geological forces. Mirazon-Lar stands by the massacre interpretation, pointing to the bound hand positions and the projectile points embedded in living bone. And then there is the more uncomfortable reading: the presence of foreign obsidian, the systematic killing across all age and sex groups, the execution-style positioning. Some researchers have suggested this was not a resource raid at all, but deliberate territorial extermination. Proto-genocidal behavior at 10,000 years ago. That interpretation pushes the concept of total warfare far deeper into the past than most models allow. It directly challenged the theory that warfare emerged only with agriculture and property. 27 people, bound hands, obsidian blades from a distant region, a pregnant woman left face down in the shallows, and not a single body buried. That is where organized human violence begins in the archaeological record. But the story of humans being killed does not start with other humans. It starts much earlier, with something far more humbling. Number 2. Homo Habilis OH 7. The fossil designated OH7, Olduvai hominid 7, is the type specimen of Homo habilis. It is the original fossil used to define the entire species when it was named in 1964. It was discovered in 1960 at Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania, by Jonathan Leakey, son of Louis and Mary Leakey, during one of the most famous fossil hunting expeditions in the history of paleoanthropology. The remains are approximately 1.75 million years old. What survives of this individual is a collection of skull fragments, the lower part of a jaw with teeth and hand bones. A disarticulated left foot was found 200 meters away and tentatively attributed to the same individual. 200 meters. That distance matters. Homo habilis stood roughly 1.3 meters tall, about 4 feet 3 inches, weight approximately 40 kilograms, brain roughly half the size of a modern human. Despite being classified as human, this species likely behaved more like savanna chimpanzees or baboons. Small, vulnerable, low on the food chain, not the proto-hunter of textbook narratives. The skull fragments bear gouges and tooth marks that closely match the feeding damage patterns of modern leopards preying on primates. Comparative analysis identified the marks through their shape, spacing, and depth. The left foot bones bear distinct pit marks consistent with crocodile tooth damage, confirmed by comparison with modern crocodilian feeding traces. A 2024 study deployed AI-trained computer vision to analyze microscopic tooth mark images from lions, leopards, hyenas, and crocodiles. All models pointed to leopard damage on the skull. The implication is straightforward but deeply uncomfortable. 07 was attacked by two different apex predators. One got the head, the other got the foot. Two scenarios fit the evidence. Either one predator killed the individual and the other scavenged the remains, or both were competing for the body simultaneously. A prehistoric tug of war over a hominin carcass. None of the bite marks show any signs of healing, confirming the individual did not survive. The 200 meters separating the skull from the foot is physical proof the carcass was pulled apart. Crocodylus anthropophagus, a species we will come to shortly, was present at the same time and location, a 7.5 meter crocodile. The leopard responsible would have been Pantheropardus, or a close ancestor. The mainstream interpretation is sequential predation. One predator killed first, the second scavenged afterward. The body was torn apart during competition. Some researchers favor simultaneous competition, both predators contesting the body in real time. And the most unsettling reading is that Homo habilis may not have been an occasional victim, but an obligate prey species for multiple predator guilds. A dietary staple, the earliest member of our genus torn apart and eaten by animals far larger and more powerful than itself. Discover Wildlife described it as potentially the most gruesome death in the prehistoric record. Yet the standard depiction of Homo habilis emphasizes stone tools and evolutionary progress. That was 1.75 million years ago. One predator from the ground, one from the water. But the killing of our ancestors did not require size or teeth. Sometimes it came from the sky, and the victim was barely old enough to walk. Number 3. The Taung Child. The Taung Child is the fossilized skull of a juvenile Australopithecus africanus, discovered in 1924 at the Buxton Limeworks quarry near Taung, South Africa. Raymond Dart described it as a new species in a 1925 paper in Nature. It was the first early hominin fossil found in Africa, and the first evidence that human origins lay on that continent, not in Asia or Europe, as the scientific establishment assumed. Dean Falk, a specialist in brain evolution, called it the most important anthropological fossil of the 20th century. Originally estimated at roughly 6 years old based on tooth eruption, modern analysis of enamel deposition rates revised the age at death to approximately 3.3 years. A toddler. The species lived between roughly 3.3 and 2.1 million years ago. The Taung specimen itself is approximately 2 million years old. For decades, the scientific consensus held that the child was killed by a large cat, leopard or saber-toothed cat. That fit the dominant killer cat narrative of early hominin predation. In 1995, Lee Berger and Ron Clark first proposed that large birds of prey, not cats, had accumulated much of the fossil material at the site. The breakthrough came in 2006. Berger re-examined the skull after studying W. Scott McGraw's research on eagle-damaged monkey skulls from the Thai forest in Ivory Coast. McGraw's team had collected over 1,200 bones from beneath 16 crowned eagle nests. They discovered that eagle-killed primates show distinctive talon punctures around the face and in the eye sockets. Berger found holes in the base of both eye orbits of the Taung Child, damage nearly identical to that inflicted by African crowned hawk eagles on modern primate skulls. Additional scratch marks on the frontal bone, around the orbits, and on the maxillae match the patterns caused by eagle talons during feeding. Modern crowned eagles are roughly the size of American bald eagles, 10 to 12 pounds, but are considered among the most powerful raptors relative to body size. They can kill prey, weighing up to 30 kilograms. Their feeding mechanics are specific. They do not carry whole prey. They dismember rapidly on sight, eat viscera first, then carry pieces, especially the head, back to the nest to feed chicks. The Taung Child at 3.3 years old would have been comparable in size and weight to the monkeys these eagles routinely kill and carry. There are documented modern reports of crowned eagles attacking human children in sub-Saharan Africa. This predator-prey dynamic has not fully ended. Berger described his moment of realization. He said he almost dropped down when he looked into the eyes of the skull. Thousands of scientists, including himself, had overlooked the critical damage. The eagle predation interpretation is now dominant, supported by extensive comparative data from over 1,200 bones. The original leopard hypothesis still has defenders who argue the orbital damage could result from geological compression or carnivore gnawing during scavenging. And the most speculative reading is that the Taung site was not a single predation event, but a habitual eagle feeding station accumulated over decades. Crowned eagles systematically and routinely hunting hominin children as a dietary staple. The quarry itself was destroyed by mining operations shortly after discovery, making any further excavation permanently impossible. The most important fossil of the 20th century is a toddler killed by talons through the eyes, ground predators, aquatic predators, aerial predators. Our ancestors were hunted from every direction, but lethal cross-domain predation was not unique to hominins. 150 million years earlier, a single slab of limestone captured an event where 3 entirely different organisms died trying to eat each other. Number 4, the triple death fossil. The Solnhofen limestone beds of Bavaria, Germany, are among the most important fossil sites on Earth, famous for Archaeopteryx, famous for exquisitely preserved Jurassic specimens, and famous for a single limestone slab that captured 3 organisms frozen in the act of killing and dying. Late Jurassic period, approximately 150 million years ago. The first animal is Ramphorhynchus munsteri, a long-tailed pterosaur with an estimated wingspan of roughly 2 meters, large eyes, interlocking needle-like teeth, a specialized aerial fish hunter. The second is Leptolepides, a small herring-sized fish found halfway down the pterosaur's throat. The third is Aspidorhynchus acuterostris, a larger predatory fish approximately 1 meter long with an elongated pointed snout used for ramming or spearing prey. The reconstructed sequence goes like this. Ramphorhynchus swoops to the water surface and catches the Leptolepides. It begins swallowing. While doing so, Aspidorhynchus attacks from below. The larger fish's snout pierces clean through the pterosaur's wing membrane, trapping both animals in a fatal entanglement. Neither can free itself. The pterosaur cannot fly with a fish in its throat and a larger fish impaled through its wing. The fish cannot retract its elongated snout. Aspidorhynchus drags the pterosaur underwater. All 3 die, likely by drowning and suffocation. They sink to the oxygen-depleted lagoon bottom, where the anoxic conditions prevent scavenging and preserve them in extraordinary detail. This is one of only a handful of fossils in existence that captures a 3-organism predation event frozen mid-action. Ramphorhynchus and Leptolepides are frequently found together in Solnhofen beds, confirming this predator-prey relationship was routine. The entanglement theory is further supported by multiple specimens showing a Spiderhynchus associated with pterosaur remains. The mainstream reading is a straightforward cascading predation accident. 3 animals caught in a chain of interactions that went fatally wrong for all involved. Some researchers have questioned whether the 3 organisms are truly associated from a single event or whether currents brought separate carcasses together post-mortem. But the physical entanglement, the snout through the wing membrane, argues strongly against that. The most speculative interpretation is that Aspidorhynchus may have deliberately targeted low-flying pterosaurs as prey. Not accidental entanglement, but an evolved cross-domain hunting strategy. 3 animals, 3 kills, 0 survivors. Preserved for 150 million years on a single slab of stone. The Jurassic seas and skies were not separate ecosystems. They were violently interconnected. And while cross-domain predation locked organisms together in death across species lines, some of the most methodical violence in the entire fossil record would come from within a single species, not predator against prey, but kin against kin, processed with the same tools and discarded in the same pile as dinner. Number 5. The Moula-Guercy Neanderthal Butchery. Moula-Guercy is a cave 80 meters above the Rhone River in the Ardèche region of southeastern France. It has been excavated since 1991 by French archaeologist Alban de Fleur, later joined by paleoanthropologist Tim White of UC Berkeley, one of the world's foremost authorities on Homoean taphonomy. The cannibalism evidence comes from a tightly controlled archaeological layer dated to approximately 100,000 to 120,000 years ago during the Eemian interglacial period. 78 Neanderthal bone fragments were recovered belonging to a minimum of 6 individuals, 2 adults, 2 adolescents aged 15 to 16, 2 children aged 6 to 7. Every skull and long bone had been broken open. Only the small hand and foot bones remained intact. That pattern is consistent with marrow extraction from the larger, marrow-rich bones, while ignoring the small ones that contain too little to bother with. The cut marks reveal systematic butchery. Cheek muscles were filleted from the skulls of 2 young individuals. The tongue was sliced out of at least 1. Tendons were severed at the Achilles, the elbow, and the toes. A large femur was placed on an anvil stone and repeatedly struck with a hammer stone. Percussion marks are visible on one side, anvil striations on the other. The goal was to crack it open for the calorie-dense marrow inside. The clavicle was cut to disarticulate the arm from the shoulder, the exact same technique used on deer carcasses found in the same deposit. That last detail is the most important one. Human and deer bones were found mixed together in the same layer, processed with identical methods, and discarded identically. They were treated as the same category. Food. The bones show few signs of burning or roasting, suggesting flesh was consumed raw or stripped before any cooking occurred. Tim White stated the forensic evidence is excellent and that no known mortuary practice produces this specific pattern of damage. The study was published in the October 1st, 1999 issue of Science. It is considered the most rigorous documentation of Neanderthal cannibalism ever produced. De Fleur and Desclos' 2016 follow-up argued the cannibalism occurred during extreme environmental upheaval. The Eemian warming event caused ecosystem collapse and prey depletion across Europe. Their proposal is that most Neanderthal populations migrated or died out entirely, and those who remained turned to cannibalism out of desperation. The rebuttal, published by Ludovic Slimak and Christopher Nicholson, argues that cut marks alone do not prove cannibalism. They could indicate mortuary practices or excarnation, the ritual removal of flesh from bone as part of funerary customs. However, the identical treatment of human and animal bones, combined with the complete absence of any burial context, makes the food processing interpretation dominant. The most disturbing reading is that the lack of conceptual distinction between human and animal processing could indicate Neanderthals did not cognitively separate person from prey. Cannibalism may not have been a desperate last resort, but a conceptual non-event. 2 children aged 6 to 7, 2 teenagers aged 15 to 16, 2 adults, all filleted, dismembered, cracked open for marrow, and their remains tossed alongside animal scraps. That forensic picture is complete, and the largest predator sharing the same ancient landscape as our earliest ancestors was even more efficient at making them disappear entirely. Number 6. Crocodylus anthropophagus. The species name comes from Greek. Anthropos, meaning human. Phagos, meaning eater. The researchers who described this animal in 2010 chose that name because the evidence of it preying on human ancestors was that unambiguous. Christopher Brochu of the University of Iowa and colleagues published the formal description based on fossils from Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania, the same site where Homo habilis and Paranthropus boisei were found. The holotype specimen was discovered in 2007. An additional cranium nicknamed Black Sun was found in 2016 during an annular solar eclipse. The species dates to approximately 1.84 million years ago, estimated body length 7 to 7.5 meters, 23 to 25 feet. Roughly the size of the largest modern Nile crocodiles, but with a distinctly different skull architecture, including prominent triangular horns above the ears and a deeper, more robust snout. It was the single largest predator that human ancestors encountered at Olduvai, bigger than any contemporary cat, hyena, or wild dog. Multiple hominin bones from the site bear crocodile bite marks attributed to this species. Marks appear on bones of Homo habilis and Paranthropus boisei. Here is the critical detail. The identifiable bite marks come from subadult crocodiles, younger, smaller individuals. Brochu noted that full-size adults would have been capable of consuming a hominin entirely, leaving zero fossil trace. That means the true scale of crocodilian predation on our ancestors is almost certainly vastly underrepresented. The biggest and most successful kills left no evidence at all. The ecological trap was simple and inescapable. Hominins needed freshwater. Freshwater is precisely where crocodiles ambush hunt. Wetlands, lake shores, river margins. The encounters were virtually inevitable. The related species Crocodylus thorbjornarsoni, found in the Turkana Basin of Kenya, was even larger, up to 7.6 meters, and likely also preyed on hominins. Put this in modern terms. Small, slow hominins, approximately 4 feet tall and 40 kilograms, approaching water to drink, being ambushed by a 25-foot, multi-ton reptile that evolved in the exact same habitat. Modern Nile crocodiles kill hundreds of people annually across Africa. 1.84 million years ago, their evolutionary ancestor was specifically adapted to eat us, and we were half the size we are now. The mainstream interpretation is opportunistic ambush predation. Same sit and wait strategy applied to any appropriately sized prey. Some researchers argue the bite marks represent post-mortem scavenging rather than active predation. And the most speculative view is that the persistent co-occurrence of giant crocodilians at every major hominin site in East Africa suggests these predators may have been a primary selective pressure driving hominins toward dryland adaptation and away from aquatic habitats entirely. Crocodiles may have literally shaped the trajectory of human evolution by being too lethal to coexist with. Scientists examined the totality of the evidence and concluded the most accurate name they could give this animal was literally human eater. And yet the next entry shows that the violence was not only coming from other species. By 1.45 million years ago, it was coming from within. Number 7. The 1.45 million year old Butchered Shin Bone. In 1970, Mary Leakey recovered a left tibia from the Turkana region of northwestern Kenya. It entered the collections at the Nairobi National Museum and sat there for over 45 years. In 2017, Smithsonian paleoanthropologist Brianna Paubiner was examining the bone looking for animal bite marks, evidence of which predators hunted early humans. Instead, she immediately recognized stone tool cut marks, the same type she had personally identified on hundreds of butchered animal bones from the same time period and region. Her methodology was rigorous. She made molds of the marks using dental impression material and sent them blind, with zero context about the specimen's identity, to co-author Michael Pante at Colorado State University. Pante created high-resolution three-dimensional scans and compared the mark shapes against a database of 898 known tooth, butchery, and trample marks from controlled experiments. 9 of 11 marks were positively identified as stone tool cut marks. The remaining 2 were consistent with the large cat bite marks, most closely matching a lion or a saber-toothed cat species. The cut marks are oriented in the same direction, concentrated where the calf muscle attaches to bone. That is consistent with systematic deliberate meat removal. Published June 26, 2023 in Scientific Reports. The bone was initially classified as Australopithecus boisei, then reclassified as Homo erectus in 1990. Today, experts agree there is insufficient morphological information to assign it to any specific species. That taxonomic ambiguity is the crux of the problem. If the butcher and the victim were the same species, it is cannibalism. If they were different hominin species, it is one evolutionary cousin consuming another. The stone tool cut marks and the cat bite marks do not overlap, making the sequence of events impossible to determine. Did hominins scavenge a cat kill, or did a cat later scavenge a hominin butchery site? Pobener's interpretation is direct. The meat was most likely eaten for nutrition rather than for ritual. This pushes hominin-on-hominin consumption back to 1.45 million years ago, over 10 times further into the past than well-documented Neanderthal cannibalism. Sylvia Bello of the Natural History Museum, London, noted that complete consumption leaves no trace, so the true frequency is permanently unknowable. The oldest evidence of our relatives eating each other sat in a drawer for 47 years before anyone looked closely enough. And in a completely different branch of the Tree of Life, 150 million years ago on an isolated island, the same pattern played out at a much larger scale. Number 8, the Allosaurus impaled through the crotch. An Allosaurus pubic bone from the late Jurassic, approximately 155 to 150 million years ago, found in North America, tells the story of a death that took weeks. Allosaurus was the apex predator of its ecosystem, up to 12 meters long, approximately 2 tons. Powerful jaws and large hand claws used for slashing prey. Stegosaurus was its primary adversary, up to 5 tons. Armed with the thagomizer, a cluster of 4 bony spikes at the tail tip, each spike 60 to 90 centimeters long. The term thagomizer was coined by cartoonist Gary Larson in a 1982 Far Side comic and later adopted by paleontologists as the actual scientific term. No prior anatomical name existed. The pubic bone bears a massive near-circular puncture hole consistent with the diameter and penetration profile of a Stegosaurus tail spike. The wound location, essentially the crotch and lower abdomen, suggests the Stegosaurus struck upward or laterally, while the Allosaurus was above or beside it during an attack. The wound did not kill the Allosaurus immediately. Adjacent to the puncture hole is a fist-sized abscess. Abscesses form over days to weeks as the immune system mounts an inflammatory response to infection. Their presence is definitive proof the animal survived the initial impalement. The likely cause of death was sepsis, systemic blood poisoning from the infected wound, a slow, agonizing process involving escalating fever, tissue necrosis, and progressive organ failure. During this period, a 10-meter, 2-ton apex predator would have been unable to hunt, increasingly feverish, leaking pus from a wound in its pelvis. For a carnivore dependent on pursuit or ambush predation, a crippling pelvic injury means starvation compounded on top of infection. Death by multiple simultaneous causes. Additional corroborating evidence exists from separate specimens. An Allosaurus tail vertebra shows a partially healed puncture from a Stegosaurus spike. A Stegosaurus neckplate bears Allosaurus tooth marks. These multiple pathological specimens demonstrate that violent confrontations between the two species were not rare, but a recurring feature of late Jurassic ecology. Robert Bacher has identified the thagomizer as one of the most effective defensive weapons ever evolved. The mainstream reading is predator-prey combat gone wrong for the predator. Some have suggested the puncture could result from intraspecific combat or post-mortem damage, but the abscess requires a living immune response. The most speculative reading is that the placement of the wound in the vulnerable lower abdomen, combined with evidence of repeated confrontations across multiple specimens, suggests the thagomizer may have been swung with some degree of targeting accuracy, aimed at soft, unarmored areas rather than swung randomly. This is not a quick, dramatic death. It is the Jurassic equivalent of being gut-stabbed and spending 2 weeks dying in a field while infection shuts down every organ system. And on an island 70 million years later, a different predator would face the same problem of dwindling options and arrive at a different solution entirely. Number 9. Majungasaurus. Majungasaurus crenatissimus was a medium-large abelosaurid theropod from late Cretaceous Madagascar, approximately 70 to 66 million years ago. The final chapter before the mass extinction. Adults reach 6 to 7 meters long, 1,000 to 1,500 kilograms, a prominent rounded horn on the skull, 4 limbs, even more reduced than those of T. rex, functionally useless for grasping. It was the undisputed apex predator of its isolated island ecosystem. Madagascar was already an island by the late Cretaceous. That geographic isolation meant Majungasaurus evolved with a closed, limited prey base and no competing large predators. The primary evidence of cannibalism comes from Majungasaurus bones bearing tooth marks that precisely match the size, spacing, and shape of other Majungasaurus teeth. No other animal on the island could have produced them. Raymond Rogers, David Krause, and Christina Curry Rogers documented this in a landmark 2003 paper in Nature. It was the first confirmed case of cannibalism in any theropod dinosaur. The tooth marks appear on multiple specimens, including limb bones and other postcranial elements. This is not a single isolated incident, it is a repeated behavioral pattern across the population. The marks are scored into bone in patterns consistent with active feeding and meat removal, not accidental contact during combat. Madagascar's late Cretaceous environment was semi-arid with severe seasonal droughts. Resource scarcity during dry periods may have driven desperate feeding behavior. Majungasaurus also preyed heavily on sauropods like Rapetosaurus. Its skull was adapted for powerful biting, robust enough to crush bone and access calorie-dense marrow. The mainstream reading is opportunistic scavenging during drought, feeding on already dead members of its own species when other food was depleted. An alternative view is active intraspecific predation, stronger or larger individuals hunting weakened, juvenile, or injured members as a regular supplementary food source. The most speculative reading is that cannibalism on isolated islands may not be a sign of desperation, but an evolved survival strategy, normalized over millions of years when the boundary between predator and prey collapses. An isolated ecosystem dwindling resources, a top predator with no food source remaining except itself. And 40,000 years ago in northern Europe, the last Neanderthals would face a grimly similar situation, but with one additional detail that makes their case uniquely disturbing. Number 10. The Goyet Cave Neanderthals. The Goyet Caves, specifically the Troisième Caverne, are part of a karstic cave system near Namur in Belgium, first excavated in the 19th century by Edouard Dupont. The modern reanalysis of the human remains was led by Hélène Rougier of California State University Northridge, published in 2016 in Scientific Reports. It established the first clear evidence of Neanderthal cannibalism in northern Europe. The remains have been radiocarbon dated to between 40,500 and 45,500 years ago. That places them squarely in the final millennia before Neanderthals went extinct around 40,000 years ago. The collection includes bones from at least 5 individuals, a mix of adults and juveniles. The butchery evidence is extensive. Cut marks from stone tools. Percussion marks from hammer stones. Deliberate bone fragmentation consistent with systematic processing. The damage pattern matches defleshing, disarticulation, and marrow extraction, identical to the processing applied to horse and reindeer bones found at the same site. But Goyet has something no other site has at this scale, as it 5. Neanderthal bone fragments show a distinct type of use where they were employed as soft percussors called retouchers to reshape and refine stone tools after the flesh had been removed. Neanderthals at Goyet ate other Neanderthals and then picked up the leftover bones and used them as workshop equipment, a level of utilitarian treatment normally reserved exclusively for animal remains. Prior to Goyet, only 3 other sites worldwide had yielded evidence of Neanderthal bones used as retouchers: a femur at Krapina in Croatia, a femur at Les Pradelles in France, a skull fragment at Lakina in France. Goyet alone provided 5 such specimens, nearly doubling the global total from a single site. DNA analysis revealed the Goyet Neanderthals belonged to a late surviving population with limited genetic diversity. They were genetically bottlenecked. The time period coincides precisely with increasing contact and competition with modern Homo sapiens expanding rapidly across Europe from the east. Caloric context adds a layer of complexity. A full human body provides roughly 32,000 calories versus approximately 200,000 for a horse. Nutritional cannibalism is a poor long-term strategy from a purely caloric perspective, but Neanderthal bodies carried greater muscle mass than modern humans, and brains and bone marrow are calorie-dense fat sources that the butchery evidence shows were specifically targeted. The same cave yielded evidence that Neanderthals made jewelry from eagle talons and collected curiosity objects. These were cognitively sophisticated beings. That makes the cannibalism and bone tool evidence more jarring, not less. The mainstream reading is nutritional cannibalism driven by resource scarcity. A dying population consumed its dead, and pragmatically reused every available material. Rougier acknowledged that available data makes it impossible to definitively distinguish between ritual treatment of the dead and food processing. Both produce overlapping damage signatures. The most unsettling reading is that modern humans may have been the indirect cause. Territorial displacement, prey competition, habitat fragmentation. We may have created the conditions that drove Neanderthals to consume their own dead while our species was closing in from the east. The last Neanderthals, genetically cornered, shrinking diversity, eating their dead, using the bones as tools to make weapons, and time running out. What these 10 entries collectively reveal requires stepping back from the individual cases and looking at the pattern they form. Sections 2, 5, and 6, the ones covering Homo Habilis, the Taung Child, and Crocodylus anthropophagus, demonstrate that for the overwhelming majority of our evolutionary history, hominins were not apex predators. They were mid-chain prey animals hunted from every direction. Homo habilis at 1.3 meters and 40 kilograms versus Crocodylus anthropophagus at 7.5 meters, a body length ratio of roughly 6:1. The Taung Child at 3.3 years old fell within the standard prey size range of modern crowned eagles. 07's body was physically pulled apart by competing predators, and the evidence we have is the minimum. Brochu's observation is worth repeating here. Identifiable bite marks come only from subadult crocodiles. Full-grown adults consumed hominins entirely. Those events are invisible. Gone. The fossil record systematically undercounts predation on our ancestors because the most successful predations left nothing behind. For roughly 2 million years, our ancestors were hunted by cats from cover, crocodiles from water, and eagles from the sky. A 360-degree predation environment with no safe zone. Stone tools did not prevent being eaten. The butchered shin bone marks the transition point. By 1.45 million years ago, hominins were both prey for animals and predators of each other simultaneously. That dual status, hunted by other species while hunting their own, may be a uniquely hominin condition. The mainstream view is a gradual climb up the food chain through tool use, social cooperation, and brain expansion. The archaeological view is that the transition was non-linear, with long periods of vulnerability persisting even after stone tools appeared. The most speculative view is that predation pressure itself drove brain expansion. The lineages that survived were those smart enough to anticipate and eventually outcompete their predators. Every evolutionary advantage humans developed, bipedalism, stone tools, fire, language, was developed under predation pressure. From a position of vulnerability, not dominance. The cannibalism entries, the shin bone at 1.45 million years, Moula-Guercy at 100,000, and Goyet at 40,000, form their own continuum. The Kenyan tibia pushes the evidence back over 10 times further than previously documented cases. At Moula-Guercy, human and deer bones were processed identically. At Goyet, bones were consumed and then repurposed as tools. The collapse of the boundary between person and material was progressive. A human body yields approximately 32,000 calories. A horse yields 200,000. Cannibalism is nutritionally inefficient. But marrow fat provides essential nutrients during scarcity, and the archaeological evidence shows marrow was a primary extraction objective. 3 competing frameworks recur across all sites: nutritional necessity during ecological collapse, ritual processing of the dead, or the simple absence of a cognitive category separating person from food. Tim White's assessment at Moula-Guercy stands. No known mortuary practice produces that specific pattern of damage. And Sylvia Bello's observation applies to the entire record. Complete consumption leaves no trace. Every documented case represents an incomplete meal. The finished ones are invisible. Nataruk returns to the frame here because it marks the moment consumption became organized. The bound hands, the foreign weapons, the targeting of non-combatants, including a pregnant woman. This is not individual predation or individual cannibalism. It is coordinated group violence against an entire community. The absence of older teenagers among the 27 dead raises the possibility of abduction. The obsidian from a distant region proves logistical planning. The doves versus hawks debate in anthropology asks whether warfare emerged only with agriculture and property or extends deeper. Nataruk supports the hawk's position unambiguously. Organized lethal intergroup violence predates farming by thousands of years. modern parallels exist. Intergroup violence among chimpanzees includes coordinated raids, deliberate killing of non-combatants, and territorial elimination. The behavioral roots may extend far deeper than the human lineage. Stojanovsky's rebuttal arguing for a post-depositional damage remains a minority position. Bound hand positions and projectile points embedded in living bone are difficult to explain as natural geological processes. The most uncomfortable reading remains territorial extermination, systematic targeting of all age and sex groups using weapons from a foreign region, which brings us to the central question implied by this script's title. Why are these findings not shown? The Taung Child is presented as an evolutionary milestone, not as forensic evidence of a toddler killed by talons through the eye sockets. Homo Habilis is depicted alongside stone tools and progress diagrams, never as a species routinely torn apart by competing predators. No life-size reconstruction of Crocodylus anthropophagus has ever been placed alongside the tiny hominin species it consumed. The scale comparison, 7.5 meters versus 1.3 meters, would be viscerally unsettling. The Moula-Guercy evidence has never been depicted in any public context. The Goyet bone tool concept remains confined to academic publications. The Butchered Shin Bone sat in a drawer for 47 years before anyone recognized what it was. Public-facing natural history presentations serve a narrative function. They tell the story of progress, adaptation, and the triumph of intelligence, not the story of being eaten, cannibalized, or massacred. Curatorial decisions are not neutral. Every choice about what to show and how to label it encodes an argument about what evolutionary history means. The famous March of Progress image, the ape-to-human walking sequence, is one of the most misleading visual metaphors in all of science. It implies linear advancement, not the messy, violent, predation-scarred reality. Accurately depicting a pregnant woman with bound hands killed by obsidian weapons would force a confrontation with human nature that most audiences are not prepared for. The caloric analysis of human bodies is itself transgressive information. Reducing a person to nutritional content crosses a boundary people instinctively resist. Institutions balance education with visitor experience. Graphic depictions may distress audiences and distract from broader scientific narratives. That creates a two-tier knowledge system. Specialists access the full evidence. The general public receives a curated version. Some institutions have begun incorporating more candid information. The Smithsonian's Human Origins exhibit includes material on early violence and predation, but graphic, contextualized depictions remain rare. Digital reconstruction and immersive technology now make it possible to convey evidence without displaying actual remains. Very few institutions have pursued this approach. Every sanitized presentation is a choice, and every choice about what not to show teaches its own quiet lesson about what we consider acceptable to know about ourselves. The fossil and archaeological record is not a curated exhibition. It is an unedited archive that preserves what actually happened. The fundamental forces governing living systems, competition for resources, predation pressure, scarcity-driven behavior, adaptation through violence, operated identically 150 million years ago and 10,000 years ago. Every species in this account, from Ramphorhynchus to Homo sapiens, was subject to the same laws. Eat or be eaten, adapt or die, consume or be consumed. The violence documented across these 10 entries is not aberrant behavior. It is the baseline condition under which all complex life evolved. Innovation itself, the thagomizer, stone tools, obsidian weapons, bone retouchers, emerge not from comfort, but from existential threat. These are not stories of cruelty. Cruelty requires intent and moral awareness. These are stories of organisms operating under the fundamental pressures that govern all biology. What makes humans unique is not that we escaped these forces. We did not. It is that we can recognize them, name them, and choose, sometimes, to act against them. That capacity for discomfort, for being genuinely disturbed by what we were, may be the most reliable measure of the distance between what shaped us and what we have chosen to become. The archive does not judge, it only records. What we do with what it shows us is the only part that remains up to us.